What the book by Sharma demonstrates is while it may be true that there's been an upsurge in free market ideology, it's just not the case that there's been a corresponding policy implementation of it.
One of the themes that we've talked a lot about is the loss of self-esteem and the role that that plays in the loss of freedom. Imagine a doctor, somebody who puts that much effort into their work and is willing to spend a third or more of his time filling out pointless paperwork. I think it drives a lot of good people out of medicine.
Who can afford the incredible compliance teams and accountants and this whole process of going through the government bureaucracy to show them that our books are clean? Only the big and massive companies that are already established and that can have some political pull and can play the game and invest in incredible resources that we already have into that compliance.
Are financial crises the result of laissez-faire policies, of institutionalized government? Did the American economic system undergo a neoliberal shift after the 1980s? Is it true that the decline in competition and systemic misallocation that we see today is a product of capitalism? Today, joined by author Don Watkins and Vice President of Fundraising and Marketing at ARI, Associate Fellow Robertas Bakula, and Fellow Ben Baer, we're going to discuss the book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism, by Ruchir Sharma. Thanks for joining me. So, one reason we chose this book is because there's a widespread recognition that we're in a period of crises, both cultural and economic, and a lot of people want to blame capitalism at different levels for those crises. And part of the central myth or narrative around that is this idea that there's been a neoliberal shift, a shrinking of government, an expansion of free market policies, privatization, deregulation, approximately since the 1980s until today. And that is at least partly or largely to blame for some of these crises. And what I think is interesting about this book is that it's aiming to challenge this narrative. For example, by challenging the idea that it's neoliberal deregulation that led to the 2008 financial crisis, or that the social safety net has been eroded by the shrinking of government, and that it's gotten smaller instead of bigger. So there are a few questions that we'd like to answer here and discuss. One is, I want to ask, does this book successfully challenge conventional narratives about neoliberalism? Does Sharma successfully do that? Does he offer unique and valuable insight into the economic crises of the 20th century to the present in general? And then what does he offer as a solution to that? What is his view of how we can restore capitalism to a proper form? And so I'd like to start with just a summary of the main points of the book, just to get us all on the same page, and then discuss some of the central tenets of his arguments. So part of what I thought was really interesting about this book is his motivation, that he thinks we need to understand the history and mechanisms of capitalism better, that it's widely misunderstood. And then in particular, he feels that his country, that India, where he grew up during the socialist policies of the second half of the 20th century in India, has been held back because of over-regulation, because of the welfare state in India, and because of the excessive reliance on government and this excessive involvement of government in the economy. So let's turn to addressing the different parts of his book. And I think we can start with thinking about, like, why is this book worth reading? Like, why did we think it was interesting to discuss? And so go ahead, Ben. I think you had some points about that.
Well, first, it's just for our audience, it's important. You characterized the movement that he's commenting on the neoliberal economics. And an American audience might wonder what that means, because liberal in American politics usually means left wing. Neoliberal, though, is the term they typically use in Europe to describe what is often called the right wing in American politics. That is free market economics, capitalism, laissez-faire. And so one of the things I thought was most interesting about this book, as you already began to indicate, Tristan, is the way that it provides just a kind of thorough refutation of this myth that is common on the left, that so-called neoliberal, that is to say free market economics, have been expanding ever since the time of Reagan. And I mean, you see this trope all over the place. I remember it in particular. There was a book written about Ayn Rand. This is a podcast by the Ayn Rand Institute, the one by Lisa Duggan, Ayn Rand and the Culture of Greed, Mean Girl. And she makes the case that all this neoliberal expansionism is Ayn Rand's fault. And I read that book thinking, oh, if only that were so. If only it were true that we were implementing her policies. And what the book by Sharma demonstrates is while it may be true that there's been an upsurge in free market ideology, increasing popularity of Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and Hayek since the time of Reagan, it's just not the case that there's been a corresponding policy implementation of it. There have been little token things that people like Reagan implemented, but when you look at the bigger picture, at the broader context, it's just not so. And Sharma does a really good job documenting that, showing how, for example, in the Reagan administration, that even though maybe top income taxes were cut, there was just a whole variety of other taxes, corporate taxes, capital gains taxes, payroll taxes that were increased and that made up for any gain that might have come from those top rate income tax cuts. And on top of that, of course, massive increase in deficit spending, which has to be funded by taxes or inflation later. And I was shocked to see that Reagan apparently expanded government employment by 1 million people. You could say the same thing about the Trump administration today. I won't go through all the details, though Sharma presents quite a lot of them, making clear that there's just been an ongoing advance of not only welfare spending, but the regulatory state, number of government employees, obviously a rate of deficit spending given the rapidly increasing national debt and budget deficit. And this most recent big, beautiful bill, so-called, is the kind of capstone of all of that under the Trump administration. And I've not seen anybody assemble all of this information all together in one place to make it so clear why it's a rapid onslaught of statism in economics that we've experienced over the last 50 years, and very contrary to the left-wing myth, which is then used as that myth is used to argue for further restrictions on free markets.
I agree with Ben in a sense of how thorough Sharma is in his book on going after this myth. And he doesn't spend too much time on trying to argue about neoliberalism from a very abstract perspective, but he's like, okay, let's take a look at all the claims that people make about the onslaught of free market private policies in the last 40, 50 years. And the amount of research and fact-driven history in the book is just incredible in a way that I haven't seen before in one place, like Ben is saying. And sometimes he puts it in such a powerful way that it's just impossible not to see. Like, for example, when he says that there was more debt issued in 12 months after the start of the pandemic compared to total debt ever since 1776, since the founding of America. That fact, just when he puts it that way, it blows you away. And when he shows you, there is some arguments that since Reagan, the percentage of people working for the federal government seems to be going down from 18% to 15%. But then he says, well, that's only if you completely ignore the exploding amount of private contractors working for the government, just the shift in accounting. And then that since 1910s, there was only increase in government spending, and all of that increase is on welfare, not on government basics like police or the functions that we here at the Ayn Rand Institute would think are the proper functions of government, but it is on welfare, it is on social spending. And again, he shows everybody thinks United States is sort of very austere country compared to, let's say, more socialist Scandinavia or Europe with much more generous welfare states, at least seemingly. And if you rank United States, he says, you can find it in number 30. But if you actually count all social outlays, all social spending on social welfare programs, then US is number 2 in the world, number 2. And that's telling to people who think that United States is the most austere, that the welfare programs are almost non-existent, that the United States is very different from Europe and every other sort of welfare state. And Sharma goes again and again, and there's many more facts and history that he shows that all of that is just not true. If you, like Ben said, you can follow the rhetoric of Reagan or the 80s about like we need to cut the state. Carter sort of run a campaign very loudly on cutting agencies, and so did Nixon and Reagan. But if you follow the facts, and Sharma follows them detail by detail, then you find no shrinkage of government in decades.
And we're number 2 only behind the French. Rare distinction. And that's because, as mentioned, people don't think of Social Security as a form of the welfare state, but they think of it as something they've earned, and part because they did pay for it, they paid into it, but they don't have an account. It's a transfer. It's still a form of redistribution from the young to the old.
I mean, the thing I found interesting, because what the so-called neoliberal narrative is, I mean, Yaron Brook and I referred to it in Equals and Fair as the inequality narrative, because it's been promulgated really since the 80s, but in particular during the 2010s. There was just a proliferation of books and papers making this kind of argument. And so, you know, we albeit briefly showed, no, look, like government's been growing in all of these ways. What I think Sharma has more of that. But what's particularly interesting is he's trying, I don't know always successfully, but to try to paint some of the causality of the way in which those things have been responsible for many of the problems that people are complaining about, including something we should circle back to, inequality. He thinks that the rising inequality is a result of government intervention, and he gives a lot of attention to something that Tristan mentioned, I think, briefly, but it is one of the main themes of the book, which is the role of the Federal Reserve and of debt and government intervention and money, which is a really important and often glossed over and not understood factor in problems in productivity, in inequality, in decreasing productivity. And I think that I have a lot of things I don't like about the book, but that's a real achievement to try to get the causality of the intervention, not just that it exists.
Yeah, so that's a great segue to discussing that. So let's talk about that a little bit. And the first, I think about third of the book or so is about just that. It's about what he takes to be a corrective historical account of how what he calls the bailout culture and the easy money culture have developed. The bailout culture meaning the tendency towards an expectation and a reliance on the idea that government will bail out companies, will bail out whole industries, will bail out whole segments of the economy whenever there are recessions, whenever there are crises, whenever there are significant market collapses. And part of what he thinks that does over time is it just creates more and more distortions. He puts it as, so this is a quote from early in the book. He says, when the government becomes the dominant buyer and seller in the market, as it has in recent decades, it distorts the price signals that normally guide capital. So money starts to flow down the path of least regulatory resistance or most government support. And each crisis brings bigger bailouts, and leaving capitalism more mired in debt, more dysfunctional and fragile. And he demonstrates this and I agree, Don, that I think the way he goes through the history and the causal perspective on it, I found very refreshing and very insightful. Of uh, at the beginning of the book, so he's going through, for example, um, the the era of the Depression. He's really starting there and just showing how over and over, every time there's a fiscal crisis or a financial crisis, the bailouts and the expectations for bailouts just deepen and deepen and deepen, and they never really shrink back. There's never a sense that, okay, now, things are back to normal. This isn't going to be needed again. That was a really significant emergency. It just creates a pattern. So let's talk about that a little bit. And I'm curious about what your guys' thoughts were about that account of the history. And do you agree that he thinks we've established essentially a bailout culture and an easy money culture?
I think it's first important to get clear on what we even mean by bailout, by government money, et cetera. The thing that Don mentioned a few moments ago is that we're primarily here talking about monetary policy. That we're not talking necessarily, I mean, it's probably an aspect of it is fiscal policy. That is to say, when Congress has a budget and votes to spend money and to tax people to fund it and to borrow some money to pay for it as well. But monetary policy is a whole separate thing apart from fiscal policy. And monetary policy is what the Federal Reserve is responsible for. A lot of people, for some strange reason, and this is often encouraged by the left, think of what the Federal Reserve does as just another aspect of free market capitalism because the Fed is a bank and bankers are capitalists. And that's kind of the level of the superficial understanding that they have. And it's a complete misunderstanding, if not distortion. The Federal Reserve is essentially a government agency that is responsible for manipulating the money supply. And manipulation here doesn't just mean regulation of some independent entity. It means actually constituting it, creating it out of whole cloth. That's what fiat currency is. We often talk about when we talk about printing money. Money isn't printed usually in paper form. It usually is created by entering data into a computer. And of course, one of the major reasons why this is not a form of capitalism, it's in opposition to capitalism, is that when you simply create money out of whole cloth, out of thin air, as the Federal Reserve does, it's basically a form of wealth redistribution. It's redistribution of money from savings accounts to the people who are getting the created money, because you destroy the value of the dollar that the people are saving. And this is the thing that Sharma does a really great job dramatizing, is at the core of what you've been calling the bailout culture, Tristan. Where he says it really picks up is starting with Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan, who himself is associated with the case for free markets because of his longtime association with Ayn Rand, of all people, who wrote an essay for her back in the 60s saying why there shouldn't be a Federal Reserve, who then under Reagan becomes chairman of the Federal Reserve. And starting especially in the late 1990s, when there's various international financial crises, resorts to rate cuts to deal with different foreign defaults, and then does interest rate cuts, and then does the same thing after 9/11. And this policy continues and is intensified through the 2008 recession, COVID recession, et cetera. And one thing that Sharma highlights especially is the role of the way the Federal Reserve has adopted what he calls the Japan model. And here it's helpful to just understand a little bit about how the Federal Reserve works. And normally the way that the Federal Reserve targets and controls interest rates is through what they call, and it's the ultimate euphemism, open market operations. And what open market operations are essentially is the Federal Reserve buying and selling treasury bonds from the public. And it does that to either suck money out of the economy. That's what it does when it sells bonds to the public. And by sucking money out of the economy, that reduces the supply of money and that increases the interest rate. And by doing the opposite, they do the opposite. And when they buy bonds from the public, they put money out into the economy, and they buy them using money that they create out of just thin air by adding figures to the computers. And that's the typical, I mean, that's bad enough. And that's the typical way that the Fed tries to manipulate and target interest rates. That's what they've been doing for decades and decades. But the Japan model is a new twist, a new level of perversion of this arbitrary manipulation of the money supply. And it's what Sharma makes very clear is that now what's happening is the Federal Reserve simply buys treasury bonds, treasury bills directly from the Treasury Department. And so basically we're loaning money, that the government is loaning money to itself, and it's loaning money to itself with money that's basically printed in a computer. And that, of course, has a tremendous inflationary impact. And it's what was used with a vengeance, beginning especially with the 2008 recession, then again during COVID. And so it's like no big surprise that after 15 years of that, we get this spike in inflation that we've experienced in the last 3 years. And so, and one last thing I'll say about this that I think Sharma is also good at ringing the alarm bell about is that while it's true that like any involvement of the Federal Reserve in the money supply, to the extent that it's manipulating this arbitrary fiat money, is anti-capitalist, anti-free markets, and of a concern. Like when you have years of this kind of direct stimulus by the Federal Reserve, and interest rates basically go to zero, arguably even they become negative, then like at some point there has to be a correction. There has to be, somebody has to raise the rates again. That's of course famously what Volcker did, which caused the Volcker recession in the early 80s. Sharma talks about how Reagan hated that. Reagan pressured Volcker to lower rates, though because Volcker did it, we got long-term lower interest rates that powered the economic expansion of the 90s. And this is relevant, it's extremely relevant today, because this is the same thing that Trump has been trying to do to Chairman Powell. After 15 years of record bottom interest rates that have poured so much money into the economy and caused this inflation, Powell's Federal Reserve has been trying to increase interest rates to make up some difference. And now, of course, is being resisted by Trump again, to the point where Trump is concocting conspiracy theories, basically, to give him reason to fire Powell for cause, because it's illegal for him to fire for any other reason. And like just yesterday, he pulled back from that, and the markets rewarded it. But I think it's gonna be an ongoing issue between this administration and the Federal Reserve, threatening the independence of the Federal Reserve. And if you have rates now being influenced by the pressure of the executive, that's the worst thing you could have happen.
I think, Ben, I want to stress one thing you said at the beginning of your comment here, that this understanding of how the Fed works and how money creation works is really, really difficult. It's not only superficial in many people's minds, but it's a very complex issue. Like the way you presented it is, it's not even going, like you can go for hours about the details. Like, for example, for people to understand why the Fed is not a capitalist institution, because money creation is a legitimate function of a commercial bank. When a commercial bank gives a loan to anybody, business or person, it actually creates money. Like you can say almost in the same way. It's just a new entry on a asset and liability side of a balance sheet, and when loan is getting repaid, the money goes away in a sense. But every commercial bank, every private bank, when they extend loans, they're in the market, they're limited. They're limited by the deposits and the reserves that they have from which they can draw and create new money. Because at some point, if they're leveraged so heavily that they are waiting for the loans to be paid, but people are coming in to draw their money that they deposited in a bank, if they run out of money, that's called a bank panic, right? The bank becomes insolvent and he has to go away. So the bank has to always think, a private bank has to always think about the ratio between the money that it invests or loans out and the money that it keeps and maybe pays interest on for depositors. But the Fed, when the Fed is creating money, it's actually creating reserves for the banks in the federal system, in a sense saying, don't worry about it. It's we will tell you how many reserves you have to keep, and if you need more reserves, like we thought in the great financial crisis, we'll just click some buttons and make your reserves balloon so you can go and loan out as much as possible. And if you lose the money, and Sharma talks about that in the book, if how that is, where does that new money go? Where do banks put it? Is less risky loans, let's say, or more risky loans, or more risky investments. We'll talk more about that. Well, if you lose it, then there is this whole deposit insurance scheme and bailout culture about saving the banks who go underwater. So there is so much complexity. I'm not even touching that complexity, but there is one more point I want to add about the easy money thing. Sharma is clearly familiar with the scholarship of the business cycles and of easy money and how the Fed operates, and especially the Austrian economic side of it. The Austrian economists were people like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who studied business cycles and money creation and the relationship between the two heavily. And they were really focused on, look, we always had in an economy, in a capitalist economy, there seems to be some natural business cycle, if you will. There is a recession or a boom, but that's very confined in history, is confined to some particular industry where is a huge technological change or some change in organization that puts out of work a lot of existing professions or businesses, and then there is a period of adjustments of people adjusting to a new way of producing, new jobs, new companies, and it takes time. Where do massive economy-wide recessions that go for years come from? And Austrian economists were really focused, well, that can only be if every industry and every entrepreneur is making a mistake at the same time, and basically the same mistake, and investing in the thing that will not survive in a few years. Well, where does that come? That must come from some distortion of the signal that they all rely on. And that signal is the price of money, the interest rate, which the Fed sort of controls and regulates. So Sharma, I think, is heavily, if not explicit about it. He does mention Hayek in the book, but he's very influenced by the Austrian economists and the understanding how easy money, how existence of the central bank and manipulation of the money supply one way or another is the cause of heavy depressions like the Great Depression, like the financial crisis recently, and creates distortions across the market that cannot be associated, and we can talk about how Sharma integrates it, with capitalism. Because in capitalism, again, there are other market mechanisms that would control that. So there's more to say, but I think the important point is, yes, he's emphasizing the role of money and the role of a central bank and how that creates distortions in the market. And he does that from a seemingly with a scholarly background in economics, but he doesn't go too much explicit into that.
And here, I mean, Robertas, if you can comment on this, it seems implicit what you and Ben too are saying, and I was getting this from the book, but I think you know more about this than I do, that there's a sort of vicious cycle, if you will, or like twin like relationship between fiscal and monetary policy here, right? For example, with the Great Depression, there's the setting of artificial interest rates on the one hand, but then there's also the borrowing for all the infrastructure projects like the Hoover Dam and agricultural subsidies and so on. And
again, it's
and they kind of worsen each other, right? And I think that's part of his point.
It's important, again, to understand how the monetary policy relates to fiscal policy here, because the government can borrow to execute some functions, and we of course disagree a lot with what are the legitimate functions of a government. Like building a Hoover Dam is not a legitimate function of a government it should borrow for. But when a government borrows, it issues a bond, and then either the citizens, private buyers, businesses, or even foreign investors can buy the bond with the promise of the government that the government will pay back the money with some interest on. So the government has to pay a price to borrow. And if the government is borrowing a lot and there is a promise or a risk that the government will not pay off this debt, or if people decide that, yeah, the government is spending too much on the things that will never give return or are very unproductive and wasteful, the people will demand a higher price, a higher interest rate to lend government the money that it wants to spend on some programs, whatever it is, whether welfare or legitimate functions. But with the existence of the Fed, and especially after the great financial crisis that then noticed that shift, if the Federal Reserve buys government debt, then there is essentially no limit to how much the government can borrow, in a sense, because after the change after 2008 crisis is that now, instead of buying the bonds that the public already holds, like the public lends the money to the government and holds the bonds, and the Federal Reserve, usually the open market operation, says, okay, we need to create more money for those people to hold in the economy, so let's buy the bonds that they're holding so that they have the new money to invest or to buy more debt or whatever, to do whatever. But today, the transaction is basically automatic. The Federal Reserve is still using commercial banks to buy bonds. It legally cannot transact directly with the Treasury. But when the Treasury issues new bonds, the transaction is basically instantaneous, because the primary banks, like let's say in the Federal Reserve, they immediately buy the bonds and are immediately paid with new reserves by the Federal Reserve. So they're just an intermediary that basically made to participate in the transaction. And what in effect happens is that the government is issuing new debt, nobody wants to buy it, or they have to pay a higher price. Well, then the government will create new money to buy that same to buy the same debt. So there is no participant, no real people judging on whether government is doing a good job or not. It's just money from thin air, and the result, of course, we can talk about the effects of that. Sharma goes into big depth about effects. Is at minimum inflation, and he goes into detail where that inflation shows up, where it doesn't show up, and the distortion of the price signals in the market.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting segue here towards part of, I think, what's coming out in your comment, Robertas, is the way that debt became normalized. And I think Sharma's account of that is really fascinating. That he goes through the SNL crisis in '89, the Great Depression, then the 2008 crisis, and that more and more there's an expectation that the debt isn't going away. There's going to be a massive bailout. Insolvent banks will be rescued, and part of the lack of a check on that is then just the expansion of government in terms of new agencies and new regulations and rules. So we've been talking a lot about the expansion of debt and the expansion of monetary policy. But another interesting aspect of the history, I think, that we can talk about now is Sharma's description of the regulatory state and how that's expanded. And that's an important part of challenging this myth of neoliberalism as well. We highlighted a little bit of that at the beginning of this discussion, but just to say a bit more, people don't think of Nixon as a person who was greatly expanding the role of government, but he expanded.
I do.
I mean, we do, right? But conventionally, people don't, and certainly people on the left. And I think it's very valuable to see him go through that history of how more new agencies are being created to protect the environment, for job safety, for pollution, and even expanding the welfare state as well, so Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And once there's a steady progression, not only with Nixon but with later presidencies as well, that these agencies don't just go away. They just, once they're established, they stay and then they grow. And that's been a really important part of the story that is being missed by this idea of neoliberalism. There's one statistic that blew my mind was when he talked about how in the first 2 years under the Biden administration, new regulations added an annual average of $160 billion in economic costs and 110 million hours of paperwork. And that is something that has not stopped throughout the 20th century. Really, it's just been a continual progression. So, what did you guys make of his account of that, of the expansion of the regulatory state?
Well,
One thing, go ahead.
Well, I'll just name one aspect. So I don't put too much stock in those big aggregate numbers of trying to assign costs. I don't think you can assign costs because ultimately you're losing out on all kinds of new business models and productive endeavors that people could be engaged in. I do like that he mentioned both in the context of business, but in the context of individual lives, how much of our life is drained up in rule following, paperwork. I remember being in an airport once and seeing everybody lined up, taking off their clothes to go through airport security. And like, this is such a tremendous waste of productive ability. And these kind of these drains that add up in dribs and drabs, like that has really grown, and you can't overestimate how much damage that does. I think there's deeper consequences to it that he doesn't go into. I think one of the themes that we've talked a lot about, in particular on Kargate, is the loss of self-esteem and the role that that plays in the loss of freedom. And I think it's both illustrated and encouraged by the fact that you, like, imagine a doctor, the fact that somebody who puts that much effort into their work and is willing to spend a third or more of his time filling out pointless paperwork, I think it drives a lot of good people out of medicine. But like so I think he's touching on some issues and only scraping the surface of just how damaging they are and how far from capitalism that is.
Yeah, and one thing that happens when the folks who are willing to comply with the regulations get used to doing it is that they become, in effect, dependent on the government for oversight, and then don't know how to take care of themselves when suddenly left without it. And a fascinating example of that comes up in the Sharma book is the sort of interrelationship between regulatory policy and the bailout culture. That his discussion, you mentioned the savings and loan crisis in the early 1980s, Tristan, and this is a really useful illustration of that interplay, one that I think ultimately accounts for why the regulatory state keeps growing, because of how controls breed controls. And so he talks about the regulations in the banking industry, which go way, way back to the early 20th century, to the Great Depression, the Glass-Steagall regulations. And what they do is they basically regulate traditional banks' risk-taking, about how much money they can loan out, the interest rates at which they can loan it out to commercial customers, to normal commercial customers. And the result of that is that there's just not that much money that banks can make by lending, and it reduces the people's willingness to take risks, the banks' willingness to take risks, but also therefore reduces the amount of return that they can expect from. And this is part of the reason why you see this now in the fact that if you have a savings account, there's hardly any interest rate that you can get from it. But going back to the 80s, because of these kinds of regulations, banks start to, and banks and various other private entities start to experiment with other ways they can loan out their money that don't fall under the regulatory apparatus of banking. So it doesn't officially count as banking, but it's still loaning money to people who are doing risky things with the expectation of a high return. And this is what leads to commercial paper, junk bonds, et cetera. And the S&Ls, the savings and loans at this time, are still subject to the same kind of regulation, and they're starting to lose out to the other kind of what eventually become these kind of shadow banks. And so they're becoming less competitive. And interestingly, at this period in the 70s and 80s, there's then some deregulation of the S&Ls. And this is the kind of case that feeds the narrative that there's a spread of neoliberalism. And there have been occasional deregulations, but then what happens is the S&Ls start to get experimental, and they start to take riskier ventures, and but they're all insured by the Federal Savings and Loan Corporation, FSLIC. I can't remember the right acronym, but they then fail because they've taken out too many risky loans or given out too many risky loans, and they're bailed out. And you see this kind of moral hazard cropping up again and again, where because there's some maybe either selective deregulation, or because banks expand to an area of the economy, or investors expand into an area of the economy that just isn't yet regulated because they're trying to get out of one that is, therefore they become risky, but they're bailed out either because of some official policy, like official government insurance programs like the FDIC and the one for savings and loans, or where there isn't any official insurance policy. The judgment is made that the firm is just too big to fail. And this is what happened, of course, in 2008. And therefore, the government decides to find some kind of indirect way of bailing out the industry, not through some official insurance program, but maybe by just buying the distressed assets or whatever. This is what happens recently with the Silicon Valley Bank. And the result is that there's a culture encouraged of wherever there aren't regulations, or wherever there's been selective deregulations, there's still the expectation that now we can do whatever we want, not just because there's no regulations, but because there's an expectation that we're going to be bailed out, either because of an official government policy or not. And that, of course, then creates further reason to do further regulations, and you get what Ayn Rand, it's an excellent illustration of what Ayn Rand described as controls breeding controls. And so even when there are, momentary periods where some deregulation has been lifted, or where the forces of the economy are channeled where there don't happen to be regulations, the bailout culture encourages this irresponsibility that then necessitates further regulations when it's discovered that people are acting with no inhibition because they expect that they're just going to be bailed out.
And a point about controls bringing controls, you'll refer to the Glass-Steagall Act that regulated the banks and how much risk can they take and how can they use depositor money, which gets repealed in 1999. And people think, that's in 1999, banks are suddenly free to do whatever they want and take on risk, and that leads to the financial crisis. And of course, Sharma goes to say, no, there is a small deregulation, if you will, in the same act. But if you read the same act, more pages, tens of pages, if not hundreds, on that is about new oversight, new rules and forms that every bank has to follow to be able to participate in any of that investing or loaning activity that they want. And then in 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley Act is added so that a company, or including a bank, a CEO, an executive of a company becomes criminally responsible, potentially criminally responsible for any discrepancies in the books, like about a number. So when they file their taxes or they file their reports to the government or the SEC, they can be criminally prosecuted for mistakes, or that can be treated as fraud. And that drives what Don mentioned, the unseen thing of what regulations makes us lose. Who can afford the incredible compliance teams and accountants and this whole process of going through the government bureaucracy to show them that our books are clean? Please don't persecute us. It's only the big and massive companies that are already established and that can have some political pull and can play the game and invest in incredible resources that we already have into that compliance. And then any newcomer, any small company, anyone who doesn't have the experience or the resources to deal with the regulatory state and all the requirements, they don't even go public. That's why Sharma says there is a huge increase in the private companies since, and that's the effect of regulation. Now, both people who just decide there is no way I can go into this business because small mistake can lead to criminal persecution, and then that's an entrenchment of businesses who now face who now basically survive on the fact that they have learned and established to play the political, the regulatory game, and can afford it. So there is such a loss of productivity, and not just the amount spent on the regulation, but also how many people don't even, like Don was saying, don't even try or cannot survive in an environment like that.
And the thing you just mentioned, Robertus, of the channeling of resources toward private equity away from the Sarbanes-Oxley regulated public companies, that's then what creates a whole new cycle, because you have a bunch of unregulated players who, while it's good that they don't have to deal with regulations, they also now increasingly expect the federal bailout backstop in case they mess up. And there have already been a bunch of examples of that.
I wouldn't call them unregulated, but unregulated in the relevant respects here, but heavily regulated in many others.
Yeah, and I think part of what all of this highlights, and I don't think Sharma has this very clearly in his mind, so maybe that's to some extent a critique I have of the book, is that in certain aspects of like the identifying the causal perspectives of like why this is coming about, he doesn't talk enough about the ideological causes for why people allow this to happen and why people support this, which we can get to in a moment. But I think part of what it highlights is that there's this idea that capitalism, and in particular the financial sector, is chaotic and can't be trusted. And that new rules have to be continually applied for the sake of public interest. And then if you expand into other areas like the EPA for the sake of health, or if you think about something like OSHA, it's for safe, like workplace safety. And part of the expansion of the regulatory state then is just this constant desire to control something that is viewed as inherently chaotic. But
I actually think that's like one of the things that deeply bothers me about the book is I actually think it communicates precisely that. It has so particularly when you look at his treatment of early capitalism, even so you would think, okay, what he would say is the government's creating all of these problems, so maybe before there was all this regulation, things worked much better. His whole portrayal of early capitalism is essentially that you had these businessmen run amok who were destroying the welfare of working people, who were greedy, selfish. They made people shorter. A lot of his evidence for how it was hurting the working people is that Germans had their height go down, which Germany, as an example of capitalism during that era, is just ridiculous. And it does worry me a little bit. I think he really discredits himself in many ways in that section. If you look at his references for how is he getting this information about early capitalism, his main citation, he has one historical work, and it's a leftist who wrote some history of capitalism in the last few years, and not even like a highly regarded leftist capitalist, some guy, historian I've never heard of. He so misrepresents early capitalism, but throughout this book, the picture you get is that, businessmen and finance in particular can't be trusted. And so if you think about why government actually grew, so you mentioned that he doesn't really go into ideas. I think he's fanatically uninterested and thinks ideas are completely irrelevant. But I don't think you can understand why government has grown without getting that people have a view of these the business leaders are reckless, selfish, and we need to put them under control. And so I think he's undermining his own goals in the way he depicts businessmen.
Yeah, and I wouldn't fault him so much for failing to explore the way that ideas are responsible for the problems that he's noting, if in fact the purpose of the book was just to note the problems and he just wanted to state the facts, he wasn't trying to explain them, I wouldn't fault him for failing to do that explanation if it weren't for the fact that he himself is in so many ways advocating the very ideas that are responsible for the problems that he himself is noting. And this comes up in most obviously, I think, with his discussion of inequality, with the way that he characterizes and frames the problem with the bailout culture as, in one way or another, encouraging economic inequality. Because there's a point to what he's saying, just on a factual level, that when the spigots of government bailout money of one form or another are directed through the financial system and through the monetary policy as they are, well, then the people in the financial sector are going to be the first ones to get their hands on that money. And then so it's not surprising, that there are these, super tall skyscrapers, not in Wichita, but in Manhattan, where the financial industry is headquartered. But it's such a superficial way of understanding what the problem with that redistribution and bailout culture is. The problem isn't the inequality per se. And I'm going to stop right here because, Don, you wrote a book on this. I'd like to hear your take on his view of inequality.
So let me underscore. I do think the core point he's making, that inequality is exacerbated by, so we've talked about the government's easy money policies, and people typically think of inflation as price inflation for the goods that most of us pay, and that can definitely happen. But the primary price inflation we've seen with this expansion of easy money is in asset prices, and asset prices are mostly owned by people who are already wealthy. And this is a point that Austrians have been making for a long time about the way that government intervention drives up inequality, but most people don't know about that. But in terms of assessing what to make of inequality per se, the core thing you need to do is recognize that inequality is completely uninteresting from an evaluative perspective, because it's grouping together phenomenon that are both good, bad, or mixed. So the inequality can be produced by the fact that some people are just enormously productive and enormously successful. Or think about, is there inequality between countries that reflects the fact that some countries are more free and productive as against other countries being less free and unproductive? And he has some kind of distinction between what he calls good inequality and bad inequality, but he still treats inequality beyond a certain point as a problem, because he's not really interested in principles. And so versus things that are based on redistribution. And I said that there's a third category of things that are mixed, and that's where I think he really drops the ball. So it can be true that people in finance or Silicon Valley have, in a sense, benefited from this easy money policy in a narrow sense, but if you treat that as a condemnation of them and as that they're not productive, and his whole presentation of Silicon Valley is as if they're not productive, and I'll be interested in your thoughts if you guys want to talk about his view of antitrust. But his essential treatment is because they benefited from this, in effect, they are moochers and parasites, and I think that is so unjust and so wrong, just as a factual level, that it really, for all the virtues of this book, and I do think it has a number of virtues, I personally found it painful to read, because here's somebody who should know better. And when you're indicting business, the most productive businesses, in a book claiming to defend capitalism, like, you're shooting yourself in the foot or in the head.
One short addition to that, when the treatment of those businessmen who benefit from easy money, I agree, Don, is quite outrageous, because he treats them as if all of them know explicitly what they're doing. I was like, oh, I'm just holding assets that are easy money are going into, and I'm completely unproductive, and I'm not even trying to create anything. And that's completely wrong, because although all the financial industry and people in the financial industry and the businesses who take loans Surely there will be some who think, oh, this is a cheap loan, like my business wouldn't survive without it, but what the hell, at 0%, let's roll with it. But other people are actually trying, like many people are actually trying to invest in productive activities and finding a return. The fact that easy money, the low interest rates created by the Fed, pushes other people into riskier activities. What does it mean, riskier activities? People are looking where to create value, where to make a profit, where to put the money to the use that's most valuable. And the fact that they're putting it into companies that are not valuable anymore and wouldn't survive at a higher interest rates, or putting it into assets that otherwise wouldn't grow without the Fed, that's not, you can't just group them all as crooks who are just benefiting from easy money. But no, these people are looking for value opportunities, and the fact that they're finding them where they otherwise wouldn't be without the Fed's intervention, that's not on them. And you can to blame the producers and the financiers for that, as he does implicitly through the book, or even explicitly, like you said, his treatment of Silicon Valley. I found that really, really concerning too.
I found it very strange that among the different problems that he tried to attribute to inequality, one was that it creates a quote unquote savings glut among the elite who, so there's a problem with the fact that rich people are saving money, which is invested in creating new jobs in companies and production, and he left it completely unanalyzed, and as though we should all assume it's bad because they're keeping money in their mattresses or something.
Yeah, I think in general he has a huge problem with distinguishing genuine distortions so I think in some places he makes good points and interesting insights when he talks about genuine distortions and genuine capital misallocation. For example, when he talks about these zombie firms, the idea of companies that can't cover their debt and have to continually refinance, and that's like a genuine capital misallocation.
Well, I would even stop there because, I think that's not obvious. I think it's what's likely the case is that there are many of these zombie firms which, because of easy money, are getting loans that they likely wouldn't otherwise get, and so it's at least kind of unlikely that a market would support their continued existence. But there's too much of a perspective that he has of, I know that this is a unwise allocation of money, where the whole point of a free market is that nobody can know these things from a bird's eye perspective, and that it's something only a market can determine in the long run. And there's good examples you could give of firms that were, for some time formerly zombie status, but which, once they got new leadership, rebounded and became productive. And Barnes and Noble is a really great example of this recently. But I'm curious also what Robertas thinks about, can you, as an individual commentator, can you really make a judgment about, this is definitely a misallocation?
No, absolutely. And research in economics is even pretty clear on that. He talks about zombie companies and measures of, okay, it's a company that cannot cover their interest on their loans with operational profits for at least 3 years. And that's one of, I don't know how many definitions, like tens of definitions that can be used in research for zombie companies. And the point is, you can't ever say which company is a zombie company. It's a very vague definition, and you could sort of approximate it with different measures. But economists, for every paper that says that zombie companies are growing, there is another paper somewhere research saying that they're not growing by a different measure. And it's really hard and absolutely impossible, especially because when you think of a period of time, let's say you take companies like IBM, and you could say, well, by the 90s, it's a zombie company. But then by 2000s, it completely reinvents itself, chooses a different market, chooses a different purpose, and becomes profitable again. And you can think of Apple, it's barely surviving. And if not for the return of Steve Jobs, Apple wouldn't exist. And you could say it was survived for too long and should have gone out of business. So at any point when you would make a decision about any company that, oh, this company is like completely unproductive, it should go out of business, it's surviving now just because of easy money, you're completely ignoring that it's impossible to judge the time frame in a sense in which a company maybe is trying to reinvent itself, choosing a new market, reorganizing, has 20-year perspective. Maybe they're looking very long term, and today they look unprofitable, but in 10 years they have a very good plan. And in each individual case, that's why investors exist. That's the role of each financier who decides and goes and studies companies detailed, like for years, studies companies to decide which company can be profitable and not. And to say that someone can look at a few numbers and decide which companies are unprofitable and shouldn't exist and it's even on its own terms, like the economic research terms, it's basically impossible.
That's really interesting. So, but I guess, so I assume you agree that there, so we've talked about the kinds of capital misallocation that does happen at a broad level or at a sort of global scale in the economy. But you're pointing out, but you can't even really trace all of the individual effects of that in individual firms, even though you know that it's happening because of, for example, artificial interest rates.
Right. Well, think about this. The whole point, he talks about recessions as an important aspect of capitalism, where companies that tried, let's say, companies that tried their luck and were proven to be unproductive go out of business. That's like the process of cleanup, and only the valuable, productive ones survive. And in some sense, that's true. Capitalism does have that mechanism, and the market has that mechanism. It's a system of profit and loss, and the people who are unproductive and the companies that are productive go out of business. And sometimes that can look pretty big, like let's say the dot-com bubble in late 90s, early 2000s, which was sort of, if you will, a massive experiment on whole economy scale, because there is a new technology, the internet and the computer technology, that's spreading across every industry, and new companies just pop up like mushrooms, from Amazon to Google to Netscape and things that hundreds that we don't remember. And we have no idea which ones will be the new productive, who will become the Googles, the Amazons, the Netflixes, right? The productive ones. How do we discover that? Investors go, like venture capitalists go and invest in 10, 20, 100 companies and expect maybe 5% of them to succeed, and succeed so massively that it covers the losses of everybody else. When you can think about a recession as this happening on a whole scale, instead of one venture capitalist investing in 10 companies and hoping one will succeed, all investors in the whole industry, the whole economy, all financiers invest in different companies, and some of them will succeed so massively, and others, a great amount of others, will lose, and there will be some readjustment period and a recession. What am I driving at? Tristan, your question was?
Well, I think part of what this relates to is, and what's unfortunate about the book is, so, Sharma, I think, does a pretty good job talking about the kinds of distortions historically that are caused by the bailout culture and the easy money culture. But then he turns around and kind of, instead of identifying, okay, the problem is that people need to be like free to use their own judgment, right? Like individual investors need to be free to use their own judgment and like respond to real price signals, and like real information. And that what is happening with fiscal policy and monetary policy is you create distortions of information. But he doesn't really reach that conclusion. And I think that's part of why, Don, you brought up his view of antitrust. I think that's part of why his view kind of blurs a distinction between, distortions that are caused by government intervention and what he takes to be distortions caused by like genuine capitalistic activity. So he thinks that, sometimes big companies like Apple or Google get complacent, and they're not as innovative, and that's where there is a role for antitrust. but my sense is in reading that he hasn't learned his own lesson from like the very interesting historical perspective that he just gave us, is that that's to create artificial divisions in companies and force companies to break up, to prevent mergers and things like that, is just to create further distortions of information and
Yeah,
make it
and
harder to rely on
one
the trust.
example of how he seems to be failing to learn his own lesson on precisely this topic is what I took to be a really clear tension between his concern about the extent of zombie firm culture encouraged by various bailouts on the one hand, and then his view about antitrust on the other. Because if you seriously thought, wow, there's just massive capital misallocation, there's too many firms out there that are, unnecessarily competing with each other, and not really creating any value in the process of it, wouldn't you think, oh, gee, that must be an industrial sector where there would be more efficiency if there were consolidation, if a bunch of these competing firms were eliminated and, bought up by somebody who actually knew how to add value and actually knew how to make a profit, and knew how to produce economies of scale. But then that's the kind of firm that he seems to want to call a monopoly or an oligopoly. And it's, of course, comical at one point, I thought, where he talks about the problem with monopolies is it creates artificial prices. And then within nearly the same paragraph, it's page 239, his big examples of the Silicon Valley giants that are oligopolies are Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, half of whom don't even charge for their product, but give it away for free. And of course, Amazon has been instrumental in creating massive economies of scale that have created huge efficiencies that are massively productivity enhancing, if anything is. And of course, there are also the companies that are, because of their capital accumulation, enabling research and development into things like AI, which by his own admission is going to help productivity in one way or another. And there are times at which I think he catches himself in this tension and realize, well, I guess there's good oligopoly and there's bad oligopoly. And the good ones are the ones that actually he was talking about without realizing it. The bad ones are the ones that somehow meet the economists' theories about artificially high prices, none of which he identifies. And the job of the technocrat is to somehow balance them, to kind of do a fine tuning of the machine, a metaphor he later himself critiques, which I want to come back to. But it's rather bizarre kind of internal self-contradiction he's trying to maintain.
One problem that I think is deeper than he realizes is when he talks, he catches himself of there's obviously good oligopolies. He uses the example of Walmart, I think, and he says, look, it's clearly productive. It's like compared to mom and pop shop in the store, it's using technology, it's improving the logistics, it's driving the prices down. It's clearly a good company, even if it's growing big. And the problem that he is not driving at this intervention in the market through regulation that allows big companies to survive while the small ones go out of business because they cannot afford it, and the easy money that props up the businesses to survive longer than they otherwise would, makes it impossible to know which one is which. For us, the whole idea of the market is like the point of recessions that we tried to make. It is the process of discovery. Who is the value producer and who is not, and who grows big because of their massive success and creation, and who grows big because they have access to cheap loans or political pull. And in a real world, each company is producing something, and each company is participating in this regular environment. And it's almost impossible to disentangle how much of its success or growth or scale, if you will, depends on what? On the production of value, or on playing the political game, or being able to absorb its costs. So the issue is that we're completely in the dark now. And like when you talk about big companies, and if you're concerned with them, then you have to end up in an issue like him. When you look at companies like Google and you think it's massive, and it's now facing antitrust cases all around its business, about all of its business, but you have no idea how big it would be, how successful it would be. Maybe it would be more successful, not less successful. Maybe it would be less in a market where which was not so distorted.
Yeah, and I think this, and we can come to this, I think, as a closing critique, that something that Don brought up earlier, that um, it's unfortunate that there's a lack of searching for principles here in Sharma's work, and I think that this is an example of that, and this is an example of where it starts to cause problems in his analysis, that he's tried to give us this, and he has given us this really interesting history, and he's tried to give us a causal perspective on, okay, how did we get to where we are? But there's not a very clear sense of what are the principles here that are relevant. What's the driving cause of all of these problems? And he doesn't seem to want to, uh, you know, he certainly doesn't want to support laissez-faire capitalism. He doesn't seem to want to say, well, the problem is that, you know, government involvement or coercive involvement in the economy is inherently distortive. It's inherently unjust. It's inherently destructive. He doesn't want to reach that conclusion, and so he ends up with this relatively pragmatist vision, I would say, and I think it's interesting, the examples that he uses of success cases that he thinks, you know, America should model ourselves more on. Um, I think he brings up Switzerland, Taiwan, and he talks about,
Vietnam.
yeah, Vietnam, and it's not really clear, like, what's really the principle that he thinks is driving it. He has like some comments of, okay, their fiscal policy seems more stable. It's like, okay, but that's not really a principled view of, what are we supposed to take away from here? Like, is that really, like, are we just supposed to try to be more like the Swiss? Like, is it really just about that specific model, or like what's the principle? And he really struggles to formulate, like, what's the actual principle here, and he ends up just saying, well, you have to strike the right balance between freedom, and regulation, and government.
Well, but that's what makes his example so weird. Like Vietnam, he's like, hey, look at, they have a market economy while they have an autocratic, oppressive government. Woo-hoo. Like, is that the right balance? Like, it really is bizarre. But in the end, I think that's why the last chapter is basically a pessimist going, look, really, this is hopeless. We can't do anything. In part, we can't do anything because this whole model for why this has happened, to the extent he gives you one, is it's not ideas. It's just, well, people want growth and they weren't getting the growth that they want, so they just decided to flood us with more money. So he has a view of, I think, just people mindlessly chase short-term benefits, the game's coming due, and maybe we could do something, I hope, but I don't really think so. The idea that people could recognize the facts and set a long-range course, like, he can't conceive of that.
I mostly agree with you, Don, with one exception about that final chapter. Yeah, I mean, overall, he's a kind of technocratic pragmatist and not nearly philosophically reflective enough about it. And that's so he defaults into kind of pragmatism. But the last 4 paragraphs of the last chapter are surprisingly philosophical, but I think in a way he himself doesn't even appreciate. And like, if he were to dig into what was going on in these paragraphs, he'd see, well, there's more here than I realize. And I want to read these, because, and then try to do the unpacking that he doesn't actually do. He says, old mental models of the economy need to change. capitalist leaders have come to think and speak of the market economy as a machine, controlled by human engineers who have the power to fine-tune this engine of growth. But the economy is less a machine than a natural ecosystem, less an engine than a complex organism like a forest or ocean. The health and prosperity of any individual depends on the free interaction of billions, and humans intervene in these environments at great risk to these systems and themselves. And he goes on and says that it's ironic that left-wing voters worry about interfering in the fragility of non-human natural ecosystems, but they don't mind when their politicians intervene in the human ecosystem, in effect.
That to me was the most. That to me was like an Ayn Rand kind of point.
It absolutely is, and it's what she says in the Anti-Industrial Revolution, where she says, in their cosmology, man is infinitely malleable, controllable, indispensable. Nature is sacrosanct. It's only man that can be violated with impunity, while nature is not to be defiled. So he's observing a very interesting double standard here. But a double standard that reveals people's blind spots in thinking about human nature, that we have a nature, that it has to be understood, and that he's right that it's not like the economy is not like a machine to be tinkered with. The economy is us. It's not people interfering in an ecosystem. It's people interfering with each other. It's people who are trying to treat other people as though they are robots or animals. And in fact, there's a huge and important difference. And like the very last paragraph is I think the best. He says, the physical sciences teach that life is a cycle of constant transformation, ashes to ashes. Political leaders ignore the lesson when they listen to economic advisors claiming to know the secrets of constant growth with no death, no ash. That's not possible. They are claiming mastery over the cycle of life, and their arrogance needs to be recognized and contained before it does more damage. Capitalism is still humanity's best hope for economic and social progress, but only if it is free to work. Where I would take issue with that is it's not arrogance that's prompting this view. More often than not, it is the morality that celebrates humility, the morality that celebrates sacrifice for the sake of the greater good. And the reason that that's a problem is not that capitalism's a system that needs to be left free to work, is that individuals are living organisms who need to be left free to work by using their mind to create new values, because value isn't zero-sum. Human beings survive by creating brand new values and trading them with each other, subject to their own best judgment. And it's their judgment that this various interventions interfere with and throw the wrench in the works of. And if only he were to unpack a lot of what he's got his kind of little pinky finger on here, he'd see his own whole kind of technocratic approach of we need to find a balance between good and bad oligopoly is wrong-headed, and that's the mentality that's responsible for the continuing expansion of the state and intervention that he himself is worried about.
I really wish there was more of that in a book, what you, Ben, just described, because part of what he recognizes is, look, a lot of young people are resignating from work and pursuing an effort and pursuing ambitious goals because they know the system is skewed. It's basically that in this system where the asset owners with the easy money are being prompted and growing more rich, and it's harder and harder for a new entrant to sort of do something in this market with so many rules that are impossible to follow. More and more people are turning to socialism, young people, or to universal basic income, or like just resignation, and they don't know what to do about the world. And he talks about how post-COVID people they don't want to turn back to work at all. Like, what's the point? They're being fed up. So this pessimism about, like he says, because people are in that mindset, something like laissez-faire is completely incomprehensible. It's like to think about the free market is, he says, that's out the window. But it's exactly the positive image of what can be achieved, like what capitalism is about. How does it work? How does it make people who actually earn and deserve the rewards get them, rather than those who undeserve or do not produce them? Like this whole the establishment of what's the positive vision there, that's I missed it, and I agree with you, Ben, that that was maybe not the point of a book. But if the point of a book is like, look, here's all the causes of what went wrong, uh, and to show you that, hey, we should turn away to something different. Well, what's that different? And like there is not enough of describing of how that capitalism would look like.
Yeah, and I think when we're thinking about that, it highlights for me all the more like how powerful Rand's analysis of capitalism is. By contrast, is that when you can have a really insightful, well-researched, um, and deep understanding of the history, which I think Sharma does, and that is very valuable. I think he does a lot of work to dispel the neoliberal myth that we talked about at the beginning. Um, but when at the end he's just sort of left with concretes, and he doesn't have a clear sense of, yeah, like what's the essential point here? What's the essential basis on which to think about the economic system? Like, what's the essential relationship between freedom, and human prosperity? And so he doesn't quite identify that. I agree that Ben. I think there's a sense that I get that with those final comments that he makes, that he's like searching for it, but he's somewhat constrained by his own sort of pragmatic methodology. Um, so yeah, let's end here. This has been a really great discussion. I think this book is really worth reading for anyone who's interested in understanding capitalism and interested in uh, particularly the history of how government has expanded. I think it's very valuable from that perspective. Um, and this has been a really interesting discussion. So thank you guys for joining me.